There are moments in a woman's life that announce themselves with trumpets, with upheaval, with the dramatic crash of something breaking open. And then there are moments that arrive quietly, disguised as nothing at all. A dinner, a crowded table, a man who does not bother to look at you. Those moments, the quiet ones, are the ones that change everything. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Miss Eleanor Vane had spent the better part of 8 years perfecting the art of being overlooked. She had learned to sit at the edges of rooms, to pour tea without rattling the cup, to nod at precisely the right intervals during conversations she was not invited to join. She had learned, in short, to be invisible, and she had been so thoroughly successful at it that on the evening of the 14th of March, in the candlelit dining room of Harwick House in Mayfair, not a single one of the 12 guests assembled at Lord Harwick's table could have told you her name without consulting the place cards. Not even the man who would, before the soup course had been cleared, find himself unable to look away from her. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. That is the trouble with stories worth telling. They always begin a little before the beginning. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Eleanor Vane had been born into the kind of life that promised everything and delivered only its outline. Her father, Professor Edmund Vane, had been a man of formidable learning and equally formidable impracticality, an Oxford scholar of ancient languages who could read Aristotle in the original Greek and had not the faintest idea how to pay a heating bill. He had loved Eleanor the way scholars love anything that grows faster than expected, with delight, with pride, and with an absent-mindedness that meant she largely raised herself. Her mother had died when Eleanor was 9, of the fever that swept through their village like a creditor who will not be turned away. After that, it had been Eleanor and her father in a house full of books and cold draughts, and she had found that she did not mind the books at all. She read everything he brought home, not because she was told to, not because it was expected of a girl in a vicarage village on the outskirts of Oxford, but because books were the only door that opened when you pushed. She had been good at languages, extraordinarily good. Latin by 12, French by 13, enough Italian to read philosophy by 15. Her father had taught her quietly, almost conspiratorially, as if they were both getting away with something. He had been right, in a sense. A girl with that kind of education and that kind of household was getting away with something, stealing from a future that had already decided it did not belong to her. She had been engaged once, at 22, to a solicitor's son named Mr. Gerald Prentice, who had nice enough eyes and a firm handshake, and who had broken the engagement cleanly and without cruelty when it became clear that Professor Vane's estate, once settled, amounted to a library of 700 books, an outstanding debt to a coal merchant, and nothing else. Gerald Prentice had not been a villain. He had simply been practical in a way that Eleanor could not fault. Even as she sat in her father's cold study the night after he left and decided, with the particular clarity that grief and humiliation produced together, that she would not spend the rest of her life waiting for a man to find her worthy. She had taken a position as companion to Lady Harwick instead. Lady Harwick was a kind woman in the way that all truly comfortable people are kind, effortlessly and without cost. She liked Eleanor because Eleanor was quiet and clever and never required entertaining. Eleanor liked Lady Harwick because she had an excellent library and occasionally forgot Eleanor was in the room, which meant Eleanor could read in peace. It was not the life Eleanor had once imagined, but it was hers, and she had organized it with great care, and on most days she found it sufficient. On the evening of the 14th of March, however, sufficiency was not enough, because the Duke of Marlowe had arrived. She had heard his name, of course. Everyone in London had heard the name Julian Sinclair, Duke of Marlowe. It appeared in newspapers the way thunderstorms appeared, preceded by pressure in the air and an instinctive tightening of the chest. He had rebuilt the Marlowe dukedom from near ruin to something formidable and impersonal as a bank vault. He sat on 3 parliamentary committees. He controlled enough land in the north to constitute a small country. He was, by all accounts, brilliant, cold, relentless, and entirely uninterested in the social graces. He had also, Lady Harwick had mentioned at breakfast, been invited to spend a fortnight at Harwick House to discuss some matter of estate boundary adjustments with Lord Harwick that apparently required 2 weeks of negotiation and several formal dinners to resolve. Eleanor had nodded at this information and reached for the marmalade and thought nothing further of it. She thought something further of it now. He entered the dining room last, which she suspected was not an accident. He moved with the particular economy of a man who had never in his life needed to hurry to please another person, taking his time greeting Lord Harwick, accepting a glass of wine from a footman with a brief nod, sweeping the room with the kind of assessing gaze that catalogued everything at once and retained only what mattered. Eleanor watched him look at her. Or rather, she watched him not look at her, which was a different thing entirely. His eyes moved across the assembled guests with the methodical efficiency of someone reading a ledger, pausing on Lord and Lady Harwick, on Sir Reginald Voss, who was some manner of baronet with political connections, on Miss Arabella Voss, who was Sir Reginald's niece, and who was young and golden-haired and possessed of the kind of beauty that made rooms rearrange themselves in her favor. His gaze reached Eleanor, assessed her in the span of a single heartbeat, and moved on. She did not mind. She was accustomed to it. She simply folded her hands in her lap, adjusted the angle of her spine against the chair, and prepared to endure an evening of invisibility with the patience she had spent 8 years perfecting. The Duke of Marlowe was taller than she had expected. She had expected imposing and received it, but she had not expected the shadows beneath his eyes, the faint tension in his jaw that suggested not arrogance, but something more like exhaustion wearing arrogance as a mask. She noticed these things the way she noticed most things, quietly, without announcing herself, cataloging them in the orderly library of her mind. He was seated across the table and 3 places to her left, which meant she could observe him clearly without appearing to do so. She was good at that, at observing without appearing to. The conversation moved through its expected stations. Weather, the parliamentary session, a horse that Sir Reginald was tremendously proud of, Lady Harwick's plan to redecorate the morning room. Eleanor ate her soup and contributed nothing and was asked for nothing, which was the usual arrangement, and she found her attention drifting back, again and again, to the Duke, who was doing a creditable impression of a man engaged by the conversation while appearing to find all of it faintly tiresome. It was during the fish course that things shifted. Sir Reginald, flushed with 2 glasses of Bordeaux and his own importance, had begun to hold forth on the matter of the tenant reform bills currently before Parliament. He had opinions, forceful ones, delivered with the confidence of a man who has never needed to question whether he has the right to hold them. "The matter is simple enough," Sir Reginald announced, gesturing with his fork in a way that made the footman near him tense. Locke himself established the principle. A man's property is the extension of his labor, his very self. To impose legislative constraint on how a man manages what is his by right is to impose constraint on the man himself. It is the foundational argument, and it settles the question. Several guests nodded. Miss Arabella looked admiring. Lord Harwick made a non-committal sound that Eleanor had come to recognize as a strategy for surviving conversations about politics. The Duke of Marlowe said, "Locke's argument concerns the natural acquisition of property, not its management in a society already organized by law and class inheritance. Applying it to tenant reform is a simplification, but the underlying principle holds." Sir Reginald beamed as if he had been agreed with entirely. "Precisely so. Precisely so." Eleanor's soup spoon paused halfway to her lips. She set it down very quietly, the way a person sets something down when they are trying to decide whether to pick something else up. The principle did not hold. The Duke had not said anything incorrect precisely, but he had said something incomplete in a way that would lead Sir Reginald, who was not a careful thinker, toward a conclusion that was not merely wrong, but was actively the argument of a different philosopher entirely. She recognized it the way she recognized a passage misattributed in a text, the same small dissonance, the same itch of wrongness behind her eyes. She should not say anything. She knew she should not say anything. She was a companion at this table, not a guest. She was invisible by arrangement. She was 8 years practiced at holding her tongue in drawing rooms and dining rooms and libraries belonging to other people, and she knew with absolute certainty that the correct and sensible and self-preserving thing to do was to lift her spoon and continue eating her soup. She looked at the Duke of Marlowe, who was now saying something further about parliamentary precedent with the ease of a man accustomed to rooms that deferred to him. And she thought about the first time she had read Locke, aged 14, sitting on the cold floor of her father's study because all the chairs were occupied by books. And she thought about Hobbes, read the following year, their arguments clean and distinct as the different tones of two instruments. And something that she had contained for 8 years, something patient and quiet and not entirely resigned, lifted its head. "You are quoting Locke," Eleanor said, "to justify what is, in fact, Hobbes, which suggests either you have not read both, or you are hoping no one else in this room has." She had not raised her voice. She had not intended the words to carry as far as they did. But the dining room had arrived at one of those odd pauses between conversations, the natural breath a gathering takes before finding a new subject, and so Eleanor's voice fell into a silence that made it impossible to pretend she had not spoken. She was already regretting it. The regret was immediate and specific and entirely useless. The Duke of Marlowe turned his head and looked at her. Not the way he had looked at her when he entered the room, the brief, impersonal catalogue of a man taking stock. This was different. This was the look of someone who has been spoken to in a language they did not expect to hear in this country, and who is determining whether they misheard. "I beg your pardon," he said, and his voice was very even, and she could not tell if he was offended or merely processing. Eleanor set down her spoon with great precision and met his gaze, because she had started this, and there was nothing to be done about it now except be thorough. Locke argues that property emerges from the individual's labor in a state of nature and is therefore inalienable by design. Hobbes argues that property only exists within the social contract, that it is granted and constrained by the sovereign, and that the alternative is chaos. Sir Reginald is making the Hobbesian argument that the landlord's right to manage his property as he sees fit is guaranteed by the social structure, not by natural right. That is an entirely different claim, with entirely different implications for legislation. They cannot both be foundational to the same position without contradicting each other. She stopped. Her heart was doing something irregular. The dining room was very quiet. Sir Reginald had gone an interesting shade of puce. Miss Arabella was looking between Eleanor and the Duke with the expression of someone watching a weather event and uncertain whether to seek shelter. Lady Harwick had frozen in the act of lifting her wine glass and was now holding it suspended in midair with the stillness of a woman who has just realized her companion has lit a fire in the middle of dinner. The Duke of Marlowe had not looked away from Eleanor. Not for a single second. He said, slowly, "You are Miss Vane." It was not a question. He had read the place card, she realized, or he had absorbed more from his initial survey of the table than she had credited. "I am," she said, "Lady Harwick's companion." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment that stretched past the bounds of comfortable silence into something charged and strange. Then, and she would later be unable to decide whether this surprised her more than anything that came after, he said, "You are correct." Sir Reginald made a sound. "Now see here. The distinction between Locke and Hobbes is not a minor one in this context," the Duke continued, and his tone was thoughtful rather than combative, the voice of a man genuinely recalibrating. The Lockean argument, properly applied, would actually undermine rather than support the landlord's position in reform debate, since natural right theory tends toward individual autonomy rather than inherited authority. "You are right that I conflated them. It was imprecise." He reached for his wine glass. "I appreciate the correction." He looked at Sir Reginald then, and something in his expression closed firmly. "The argument you are making, Sir Reginald, is the Hobbesian one. It has merit, but it also has limits, and you should understand which you are using if you intend to deploy it in a political setting." Sir Reginald absorbed this the way a man absorbs unexpected rain, with brief helplessness, then a retreat toward bluster. "Yes, well, quite. The essential point stands." "Several essential points stand," the Duke said. "Miss Vane has identified one of them." He did not look at her again immediately. The conversation moved on, finding safer ground in the subject of Lord Harwick's Northfield boundary, which was, ostensibly, the reason the Duke was here at all. But Eleanor was aware, with a new and uncomfortable precision, that something had shifted in the room. Lady Harwick had lowered her wine glass. Sir Reginald was directing his remarks pointedly away from Eleanor's end of the table. And the Duke of Marlowe, though he did not look at her again, had an alertness about him now, a slight adjustment of his posture toward her side of the room, as if some instrument in him had changed its orientation. She picked up her soup spoon. She found she had entirely lost interest in the soup. The evening moved through its remaining courses with the particular slowness of dinners during which one has done something irrevocable and must wait out the consequences. The ladies withdrew before the men, as custom required, and Eleanor sat in Lady Harwick's drawing room with her hands folded and her expression composed while Miss Arabella played a competent sonata on the pianoforte, and Lady Harwick dispatched a note to her sister, and two of the other ladies exchanged opinions on a novel that Eleanor had read in an afternoon 3 years ago, and had thoughts about that no one would ask her to share. Lady Harwick caught her eye once across the room. Just once. Her expression was not angry. It was something between startled and assessed, and she gave Eleanor a single nod, so small it might have been the candlelight, and turned back to her writing. Eleanor breathed. When the men rejoined them, she was standing near the window with a cup of tea she did not particularly want, having discovered that a cup of tea in one's hand provides excellent protection against being spoken to, and also against being expected to speak. She watched the Duke enter the drawing room and perform the expected social navigation, accepting coffee, exchanging a few words with Lord Harwick, enduring Miss Arabella's practiced attempt at conversation with a patience that looked, from a distance, almost like courtesy. Then he crossed the room to where she was standing. She had 2 seconds to decide how to arrange her face. She chose something neutral and alert, which was, she thought, the most honest option available. "Miss Vane," he said. Up close, his eyes were darker than she had thought at the table, not quite black, a deep charcoal gray that had the quality of winter mornings, the particular gray that exists just before the light decides what it will be. "Your Grace," she replied. He held a cup of coffee with the easy authority of a man who takes up exactly the space he intends to and no more. "Where did you read, Locke?" She had not expected him to begin there. She had expected some courtesy, some genteel preamble. "My father's library," she said. He was a scholar at Oxford. Ancient languages, primarily, but his shelves were not organized by relevance. "He taught you." "He taught me everything. Informally, and in between other things. He was not a methodical teacher." She paused. "He was an excellent one." The Duke studied her, not with the assessing quality of his initial survey, which had dismissed her, but with a different kind of attention, the attention of someone who has encountered unexpected terrain and is revising their map. "How many languages?" "4," she said. "Latin, French, Italian, and enough German to read philosophy, though my German is imperfect. I cannot speak it well." "You read Kant." "Enough to know I disagree with him on several matters." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. It was not quite a smile. It was more like the ghost of an impulse toward one, visible only because she was watching closely enough to catch it. "On which matters?" "His categorical imperative assumes a rational actor operating in a vacuum," Eleanor said, "which is a useful thought experiment. But as a basis for moral philosophy, it tends to fail when confronted with actual human beings, who are rarely acting from pure reason and almost never in a vacuum. Most philosophers would say that is the point, to identify the ideal and work toward it. Most philosophers have not spent a great deal of time in circumstances that make ideals impractical," Eleanor said. The words were out before she had checked them. She felt the familiar internal flinch, the recognition that she had said too much, gone too far, stepped past the boundary of where a woman in her position was permitted to go. The Duke did not look offended. He looked at her for a moment with an expression that she could not quite decode, something attentive and complicated, and said, "You have." It was not a question. She met his gaze. "I have managed." "That is not the same thing." "No," Eleanor said quietly. "It is not." The fire in the grate sent a flicker of warmth across the space between them. Somewhere across the room, Miss Arabella had launched into a second sonata. Lady Harwick was laughing at something Lord Harwick had said. The ordinary machinery of a society evening turned on its well-oiled axle, and here, in the small harbor of the window, something else was happening entirely. Something that Eleanor did not yet have a name for. She had been invisible for 8 years. She had perfected it, taken pride in it, organized her life around it. And in the space of one dinner and one sentence, something had cracked open in the careful wall she had built, because the Duke of Marlowe was looking at her, as though she was not invisible at all. As though she was, in fact, the most interesting thing in the room. She did not know what to do with that. Lady Harwick tells me you have been her companion for 4 years, the Duke said, his voice returning to something more conversational, as if he too was recalibrating. Nearly 5, Eleanor said. And before that, my father's household. And before that, my father's household. She offered a small smile at the repetition. My world has been somewhat limited in geography, but not in reading. No, she agreed. Not in reading. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I am here for a fortnight to negotiate a boundary matter with Lord Harwick. So I understand, Eleanor said, and thought, without meaning to, a fortnight, and felt something she could not quite categorize stir in her chest. Something that might have been anticipation, or might have been its more sensible cousin, apprehension. I expect Lady Harwick will arrange a number of social engagements for the period, the Duke said. She generally does. Then I expect we will speak again, Miss Vane. He said it the way he had said everything else this evening, without particular inflection, with the calm authority of a man stating a fact rather than making a promise. And yet Eleanor felt the words settle somewhere specific, somewhere more than conversational. I expect we will, she said. He inclined his head with the brief formality of a man ending an audience, and moved away toward Lord Harwick with the same unhurried efficiency he had brought into the room. Eleanor watched him go and became gradually aware that she was gripping her teacup rather firmly, and that Lady Harwick, on the other side of the drawing room, was watching her with an expression of contained and private astonishment. Eleanor turned back to the window. The dark garden beyond the glass reflected nothing but the candlelight inside, gilding the room back at itself, turning everything warm. She should not have said it. That much was clear. She had broken 8 years of careful invisibility for the sake of a misapplied philosophical reference at a dinner party, and the consequences were entirely unknown, and the sensible and self-preserving thing was to resume her composure and her anonymity and proceed as if the evening had not tilted on its axis in some way she had not yet measured. She thought about the corner of his mouth, the almost smile, the specific quality of his attention. She thought about his eyes in the firelight, charcoal gray and complicated. She thought, with a clarity that surprised her, that sensible had gotten her quite far, and not particularly far enough. Outside, the March wind moved through the garden, rattling the bare branches of the plane trees, carrying the cold, particular smell of London at night, coal smoke and rain. On stone and the distant river. Inside, the fire burned warm and low, and the evening continued on its ordinary axis, and Miss Eleanor Vane stood at the window of Harwick House and felt, for the first time in a very long time, that something was about to happen. She was right. She simply did not yet know what it would cost. The following morning arrived with pale light and frost on the window panes, and the particular hush of a house that has not yet decided to be awake. Eleanor was always the first to rise. She had been the first to rise since she was 9 years old, and there was no one else to see to the fire, and the habit had never left her. She dressed without the maid because she had never been comfortable asking anyone to do for her what she could do herself, and she made her way down to the small breakfast room at the back of the house, where the morning light came in most kindly. She was not entirely surprised to find it already occupied. The Duke of Marlowe stood at the sideboard with a plate and the focused efficiency of a man who treats breakfast as a logistical matter rather than a social one. He had not yet put on his coat. His shirt was properly fastened and his cravat was tied with practiced precision. But there was something about the early morning light on him, something about the absence of the full armor of a public evening, that made him look different. Not softer exactly, more real. He looked up when she entered. If he was surprised, it was too brief to catch. Miss Vane, Your Grace. She moved to the sideboard with the composure of long practice, selecting toast and eggs with a focused attention that had nothing to do with the food. I did not know you were an early riser. I have been for most of my life, he said. It was a habit formed from necessity. I have never been able to shed it. He paused. You? The same. She carried her plate to the far end of the table, which was the appropriate distance, which was the sensible distance, which left several feet of polished mahogany between them and preserved the correct arrangements of a morning entirely lacking in other witnesses. He sat at the other end of his own accord. She watched him with her peripheral vision and told herself she was merely alert to the room. For a few minutes they ate in silence. It was not an uncomfortable silence. That was the thing that surprised her. She was accustomed to silences that required management, silences that pressed on her to fill them with pleasant inconsequentiality. This silence had no such pressure. It was simply quiet. Two people occupying the same room in the early morning, both occupied with their own thoughts and apparently content to be. You disagreed with Kant, the Duke said suddenly, without preamble, as if the conversation had merely paused rather than ended the night before. I often disagree with Kant, Eleanor said. He was a very intelligent man with a very confident theory and a limited experience of contingency. Contingency, he repeated, the circumstance that makes the ideal impossible, or at least extremely difficult. She looked at him directly. The categorical imperative works if every rational actor is operating from equal position and equal information. It does not account for the actor who has neither the luxury of time nor the safety of equal footing. You are describing someone like yourself, he said. The directness of it surprised her. She held his gaze. I am describing a very large number of people, including yourself. If you are asking whether I have ever been in a position where the ideal moral choice and the practical necessary choice were not the same thing, Eleanor said carefully, then yes, I have. The Duke set down his coffee cup. He looked at her with that same complicated attention, the specific focus of a man who has decided something interests him and is pursuing it with the same efficiency he applied to everything else. And what did you choose? The practical choice, Eleanor said. Always. And then I spent a great deal of time afterwards examining whether that made me a pragmatist or a coward. What did you conclude? She considered this, genuinely considered it, which was unusual in itself, that this conversation required not performance but thought, that the distinction may be less important than I imagined. Survival and cowardice look very similar from the outside. The difference is internal and mostly only visible in retrospect. He was quiet for a moment. She could hear the house beginning to stir around them, the distant footsteps of a maid in the corridor, the sound of a fire being built somewhere above. Pragmatist, the Duke said. She looked at him. My conclusion, he said, his voice level. For what it is worth. Pragmatism requires intelligence. Cowardice only requires fear. He reached for his coffee cup again. You are not afraid of very much, Miss Vane. Eleanor thought about last night, about the moment before she spoke, the pull of 8 years of careful silence, and the decision to set it aside. She thought about what it had cost, and what it had not cost, and what it had opened, and she thought about this moment, sitting in the thin morning light across a breakfast table from a man who looked at her as if she were legible to him in a way that no one had been legible in a very long time. I am afraid of a great many things, she said honestly. I have simply stopped allowing fear to be the final word. The Duke looked at her for a long moment. Something moved in those gray eyes, something she did not yet know him well enough to name. Then he inclined his head, the same brief gesture of acknowledgement he had made the night before, and returned to his breakfast. Eleanor returned to hers. Outside, London was waking up around Harwick House. In its usual gradual way, carts and footsteps and the distant cry of a vendor, the familiar noise of a city that did not pause to consider the small upheavals taking place in its breakfast rooms. The frost on the window panes was already beginning to soften in the pale morning sun. There were 13 days remaining of the Duke's fortnight at Harwick House. Eleanor told herself she was not counting them. She was simply aware of them. The way you are aware of a door that has been left slightly open in a room you thought you knew completely, feeling the changed air on your face, telling yourself you will close it in a moment, telling yourself you have not yet decided to walk through. The next 3 days passed in a way Eleanor had not experienced before, which was to say they passed both very slowly and very quickly, the particular paradox of time when something inside it has your full attention. She continued her usual duties. She read aloud to Lady Harwick in the mornings. She accompanied Lady Harwick to calls in the afternoons. She organized correspondence, consulted with the housekeeper about household matters that Lady Harwick preferred to delegate, sat at the correct end of rooms, and said the correct amount of nothing. She performed the careful architecture of her life as she always had, and told herself it was the same. It was not the same. The Duke was present in the house in the way that weather is present, not always visible, but felt. She heard him in Lord Harwick's study in the mornings, the low measured cadence of his voice moving through the closed door as she passed in the corridor. She saw him at dinner, where the conversation was more careful after the first evening, Sir Reginald having arranged his opinions into a safer formation and Miss Arabella having redirected her attentions toward the Duke with a determination that Eleanor observed without comment. She crossed paths with him twice in the passage between the library and the morning room, exchanging brief acknowledgments with the formality of two people who have had one remarkable conversation and are not yet certain what to do with the fact of it. On the fourth day, it rained. The rain in London in March is not a gentle thing. It arrives with purpose and intention and an absolute indifference to whatever you had planned. By 11 in the morning, it had driven Lady Harwick to the morning room with her correspondence, driven Lord Harwick to his study with the estate maps, driven Sir Reginald and Miss Arabella into the drawing room for a spirited game of cards, and driven Eleanor to the library. She had no particular objective beyond the library itself. It was the room in Harwick House she loved best, not as grand as some she had seen, but genuinely used, the books on the shelves actually read rather than acquired for effect, the chairs arranged for reading rather than display. She took down a volume on the enclosure movement that she had been meaning to return to for a week, settled into the chair nearest the window where the gray rain light was best, and opened to her page. She read 3 paragraphs before she became aware that she was not alone. The Duke was in the far corner of the room, standing before the shelves with his back to her, scanning spines with the focused attention of a man who actually knows what he is looking for. He had not heard her come in, or if he had not turned. She had a moment of decision and chose to remain still and quiet, which was her most practiced response to uncertainty. He found what he was looking for, pulled it from the shelf, turned toward the chairs, and stopped when he saw her. "Miss Vane," he said, not startled. He did not seem to be a man who startled easily. "Your Grace." She held up her book slightly. "The rain." "Yes," he agreed, as if she had made a complete observation, which she supposed she had. He looked at the chair across from hers, a question without a question. She moved her shawl from its arm in the faintest possible gesture of permission, and he sat. They read in silence for perhaps 20 minutes. The rain moved against the windows and shifting curtains, and the fire that had been laid that morning was warm, and the room smelled of beeswax and old paper and the particular comfort of having nowhere else to be. Eleanor became gradually aware that she was actually reading, actually absorbing the page, which was unusual for a situation in which she was conscious of being observed. Except that she was not being observed. He was reading too, with the same completeness she recognized in herself, the quality of a person who reads not to be seen reading, but because the page requires them. It was, she thought, the most companionable silence she had been in for years. "May I ask you something?" he said, without looking up from his book. "You may ask," Eleanor said. He did look up then. "Your father's library. When it was settled, what became of it?" The question landed somewhere specific. She kept her expression level. "It was sold. The debt to the coal merchant was settled, and the remainder went to the landlord. I was permitted to select 12 volumes before the rest were taken." 12. I chose carefully. He was quiet for a moment. "Which 12? She told him. She had not spoken this list aloud since the day she made it, standing in her father's cold study with 12 stacks of paper and 3 hours before the men came to collect the rest. She had memorized it, as she memorized things, completely and without effort, and it had lived in her since then as a kind of private accounting. Locke, Hume, Dante in Italian, a Latin grammar that had been her father's own as a student, with his handwriting in the margins. 2 volumes of natural philosophy, a history of Rome that she had read so many times the spine had cracked in 3 places. 5 others. She recited them, and he listened. Really listened, the way she had come to recognize he listened to everything, without performance, without waiting for his turn. "The Latin grammar," he said when she finished. "With his marginalia?" "Yes." "You still have it?" "I do." He nodded, as if this confirmed something he had already understood. Then he returned to his book. Eleanor returned to hers. When she looked up some time later, the rain had softened to a gray mist, and the Duke was watching her with an expression she was beginning to recognize, that complicated attentive look that she suspected was unusual for him, that had the quality of something he was not entirely accustomed to doing. "I should return to Lady Harwick," she said. though Lady Harwick had not asked for her and would not miss her for another hour at least. "Miss Vane," he said. She stopped, her book in her hands. "My father was a mathematician," he said. It was said without preamble, without the scaffolding of social approach. Just offered, plainly, as she had offered the list of 12 books. He was not a duke then. He was third in line and did not expect to inherit. He taught mathematics at a school in Derbyshire because it was what he loved. He had written 2 papers on geometry that were considered significant in their field. He paused. When he inherited unexpectedly at 41, he put all of it away. His papers, his instruments, his correspondence with other mathematicians. He put it all in a trunk and became a duke and never returned to it. Eleanor held very still. "I found the trunk when he died," the duke said. The papers were unfinished. He had been in the middle of a third proof. He never completed it. He looked at his book, though she did not think he was seeing it. "I sometimes think about that proof, about what it might have contained, whether it was close to resolution or whether he had reached an impasse." He paused again. "I cannot know. I was not a mathematician." Eleanor said, quietly, "What were you before you were a duke?" He looked at her. "Nothing so interesting as a mathematician." "What were you?" she repeated. A long moment. "A solicitor's clerk," he said. "For 3 years, before I was called back to manage the estate. I was going to qualify." He looked at the fire. "I was better at it than most expected." Eleanor thought about a young man with a trunk full of his father's unfinished mathematics and the particular grief of a life interrupted, not by death, but by duty, and felt something in her chest move with a warmth that she recognized as dangerous and could not quite summon the will to resist. "I think," she said carefully, "that it is a very specific kind of loss, to have to put away what you are in order to become what is required." He looked at her. The firelight was steady on his face. "You know it." "I know it," she agreed, though in different terms. "I am not lamenting a dukedom." "No," he said, "something quieter than that, and perhaps worse." She did not answer. She was not certain she could answer without saying too much. She was already saying too much, in every sense that mattered, and had been since the first evening, and the sensible voice that had guided her for 8 years was beginning to be drowned out by something else, something she had not heard clearly in a very long time. She said good night, though it was only afternoon. He let her go without protest, which was exactly right, which was the kind of restraint she was coming to expect of him and had not expected of anyone. She walked back to Lady Harwick's morning room and sat down and held the 12-book list in her mind and thought about an unfinished mathematical proof in a trunk and a man who had put himself away, and told herself very firmly to be careful. She was not careful. That was the honest accounting. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. By the 6th day, there were patterns forming between them that neither had explicitly established and both seemed to understand. The early breakfast, which they had both kept, arriving independently and departing without remark. The library in the afternoon rain, which had continued in the intermittent way of London spring, which is to say it rained whenever it felt the occasion warranted. The brief exchange in passing, a word or two, rarely more, that managed nonetheless to contain something substantial within its brevity. On the 7th day, Lady Harwick asked Eleanor to take a letter to the village post, which required a walk through the garden and along the lane, and Eleanor had gone gladly because the morning had cleared to something pale and tentative that almost qualified as sun. She was halfway down the gravel path when she heard footsteps behind her and found the Duke walking in the same direction, his coat buttoned against the cold, his hands clasped behind his back in the habitual posture she had begun to recognize. "Lord Harwick has released me from the study for an hour," he said, falling into step beside her with a naturalness that suggested the coincidence was not entirely one. "The boundary negotiations progress," Eleanor said. Slowly. "Lord Harwick is a thorough man." "He is," she agreed. "Lady Harwick calls it comprehensive. The staff calls it other things." He made the sound that she had begun to understand was his version of laughter, not the thing itself, but the shape of it, a brief exhale with a specific quality of amusement. She found she liked producing it. She found she was doing it more deliberately than was perhaps wise. They walked the lane in a silence that had become its own kind of conversation. The hedgerows on either side were beginning to show the first uncertainty of green, the tentative buds that March produced without quite committing to them. The village was a quarter-mile away, the path muddy from the recent rain, and Eleanor was careful with her footing in the way that a woman who cannot afford to ruin her shoes must always be careful. He noticed. She saw him notice, in the brief downward glance, in the way he adjusted his own pace slightly. He did not remark on it. He simply walked more slowly. It was the smallness of it that reached her. Not a grand gesture, not a declaration, just a slight adjustment of his pace. She kept her eyes on the path and felt it land somewhere that would not be easily cleared. "May I ask you something now?" she said. "You may ask," he said, using her own phrasing, which she noted without showing she had noted. "What happened to your father's estate before you inherited?" She had pieced together fragments from things Lady Harwick had mentioned in passing, the kind of things said without explanation because society assumed everyone already knew the broad outlines. She wanted to hear it from him. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. "My father trusted a man he should not have," he said finally. "A man he had known since boyhood who sat on the board of an investment concern my father had backed. The concern was fraudulent. My father did not know this. The man who brought him the investment did. When it collapsed, my father's name was listed among the principals, which was not true, but which was permitted to stand by the man who had been his friend, because that man's involvement was quietly buried instead." He paused. "The debt was considerable. My father spent the last years of his life managing it. He died before it was settled. And the friend," Eleanor said, "lives comfortably in the country, well regarded in his county, considered a man of sterling character." The words were perfectly level. That levelness cost something. She could hear it. "You know the truth of it." "I know every detail," the Duke said. "I spent 6 years gathering them. I could ruin him in an afternoon if I chose." "But you have not." "No." He looked at the lane ahead. "My father would not have wanted it. He was a man who believed that the manner in which you win a thing matters as much as the winning. I found that belief profoundly inconvenient for most of my 20s. A pause. "I have come to think he was right." Eleanor considered this. The man who gathered evidence and chose not to use it out of loyalty to a principle that belonged to someone else. The self-discipline of that. The specific weight it must have. "It changed you," she said. "Your father's trust being used against him. It taught me," he said, "to be cautious about trust." "And are you?" He turned to look at her, and the expression on his face was one she had not seen before on him, unguarded in a way that seemed to catch even him by surprise. "I am finding," he said, "that caution has its limits." They reached the village post. Eleanor delivered Lady Harwick's letter. They walked back in a silence that was charged with all the things that had been said and all the things that had not, and the tentative sun moved behind a cloud, and the hedgerows were very green in the gray light, and Eleanor thought, with a clarity so sharp it was almost pain, that she was in a great deal of trouble. The trouble arrived from an unexpected direction, as trouble tends to do when one is occupied watching the door one expects it to use. On the 9th day, a carriage arrived at Harwick House that was not expected. Eleanor was in the hall when it came, crossing from the library to the morning room, and she paused on the landing above to watch the new guest be received by the butler with the particular deference reserved for persons of unambiguous social standing. The woman who descended from the carriage was perhaps 35, possessed of a carefully arranged loveliness that had the quality of something maintained rather than effortless. Her gown was the precise shade of expensive that announces itself without advertising. She moved through the hall with the ease of someone who has never in her life been uncertain of her welcome. Mrs. Cecily Voss. Eleanor did not know her, but Lady Harwick, appearing from the morning room with an expression of slightly startled pleasure, addressed her by name, and the story assembled itself quickly enough. A widow. Connections in the upper reaches of society. A friendship with Lady Harwick that predated the Harwick marriage and had been maintained through the occasional exchange of invitations. A convenient friendship, as it turned out, for Sir Reginald Voss, who appeared in the hall within minutes of Mrs. Voss's arrival with an alacrity that suggested he had been watching for the carriage. He greeted her with the warmth of a man greeting an ally. Eleanor filed these observations in their appropriate place and resumed her crossing of the hall and told herself it was nothing that concerned her. She was wrong, but it took another 2 days to discover it. Mrs. Voss was charming in the way of women who have studied charm as a discipline. She was witty at dinner, attentive to Lord Harwick's opinions, delightful to Lady Harwick, and correct to Eleanor in the precise degree that acknowledged her presence without elevating it. She directed the full warmth of her attention at the Duke of Marlowe with a practiced subtlety that Eleanor suspected only Eleanor noticed, because Eleanor was the only other person at the table who was watching the Duke rather than performing for him. He was polite. He was always polite. But Eleanor, who had spent 9 days learning the particular vocabulary of his expressions, saw nothing in his face that warranted the term interested. She was not, she told herself firmly, relieved by this. She was simply observant. On the 11th day, she was in the small sitting room adjacent to the library, a room that connected both spaces and which she used on afternoons when she wanted proximity to the books without the library's formality, when she heard voices through the adjoining door. The door was not quite latched. She had not heard anyone enter the library. She had been absorbed in her work, transcribing a letter for Lady Harwick, and the voices came suddenly and clearly enough that to move would have required audible disturbance. She recognized Mrs. Voss's voice first. Clear, pleasant, carrying. "I mean only to be of service," Mrs. Voss was saying, in the tone of a woman who means to be of service to herself. "You are a man of consequence, Julian. You must know how it appears." Julian, the Duke's given name, offered with the easy familiarity of an established acquaintance. Eleanor's cool paused. "I am aware of appearances," the Duke said. His voice was cooler than she had heard it in days. "Then you understand my concern," Mrs. Voss said. "She is an intelligent creature, I grant you. A companion, doing what companions do, making herself agreeable, making herself seem indispensable. It is not a criticism of her. It is a strategy any clever woman in her position would employ." Silence. Eleanor did not move. She was not certain she was breathing. "The Fairwick gentleman," Mrs. Voss continued, her voice carefully gentle. "You were not here last autumn, but there was talk. Lady Harwick's previous house-guest, Lord Fairwick. Miss Vane was quite particularly attentive to him. It came to nothing, of course. It always comes to nothing with a woman in her situation. But the attentiveness itself is a pattern, and I would not be a friend to you if I did not mention it." The silence that followed was the longest of Eleanor's life. She set down her quill with a care that was entirely separate from her internal state, which was not careful at all. Something cold had moved through her, not quite disbelief, because she understood what was being done with a clarity that came from 8 years of watching rooms organize themselves against inconvenient truths. She understood it. She simply had not expected to be the subject of it. She waited for him to answer. "I appreciate your concern," the Duke said. She could not read his tone. That was the thing that frightened her, that for the first time in 11 days she could not read his tone. "She is well read," Mrs. Voss said, almost indulgently, almost convincingly so, for a woman of her means. One cannot help but admire the ambition. She heard footsteps, Mrs. Voss moving toward the door. "I shall leave you to your thoughts. Only do take care, Julian. Men of your position can afford everything except a certain kind of mistake." The outer door opened and closed. Eleanor sat in the small sitting room with her unfinished letter and her still quill and the cold thing that had replaced her breath. She waited for the sounds that would tell her the Duke had also left the library. She heard nothing. He was still there, standing or sitting, she could not determine, in a silence that had taken on the quality of thought. She rose. She could leave through the outer door of the sitting room without crossing the library. She could avoid the conversation entirely. She could retreat into invisibility, which was her oldest skill, her most reliable shelter, the thing she had built herself out of for 8 years. She was halfway to the outer door when she stopped. She thought about what had been said, the specific shape of it. Lord Fairwick, of whom she had absolutely no memory of being particularly attentive, because she had barely been particularly present during his visit, having spent most of it in this library, reading. The allegation, offered as friendly concern, wrapped in the language of care and delivered at precisely the moment when it would do the most damage. She thought about the Duke's silence, the unreadable tone. She thought about the things he had told her on the lane and in the library and across the breakfast table, the unfinished proof in a trunk, the man who had been his father's friend and his father's ruin. She thought about what he had said. "It taught me to be cautious about trust." She understood, with a sickening lucidity, how precisely the allegation had been designed. Not to convince anyone who knew Eleanor. to find the crack that already existed in him. She turned back. She opened the library door. He was standing at the window, his back to the room, one hand braced against the frame in the posture she had seen from the moment of his arrival, the posture of a man holding something steady that wants to move. He turned when he heard her, and she looked at his face, and found there what she had feared. The shuttered quality, the careful withdrawal, the closing of something that had been, in slow degrees, opening. "Miss Vane," he said. "I was in the sitting room," Eleanor said, which was not an apology, but was an explanation. "The door was not latched. I did not intend to listen, and I heard more than I should have." He said nothing. "I do not know Lord Harwick," she said, keeping her voice level with an effort that she hoped did not show. "I barely recall his visit. I was in this library for most of it, reading a history of land enclosure that I had been waiting to access for 3 months. Lady Harwick can confirm this, as can the library records, which she keeps with some thoroughness. I was not attentive to him. I have not been attentive to anyone in the manner Mrs. Voss is suggesting. I am a companion. It is not a position that affords the luxury of schemes." She stopped. He was looking at her with an expression that was not quite the full withdrawal. There was something held in check behind it, something that might have been conflict, that might have been the beginning of a question. But she could also see the other thing, the old flinching wound, the place in him that had learned what betrayal looked like and had learned to close against it faster than thought. "I cannot prove a negative," she said quietly, "and I would not insult either of us by trying further." She paused. "I would ask only one thing." He waited. "Consider the source," she said. "Consider who benefits from what she said, and whether that consideration affects its value." She held his gaze for one more moment, long enough to let him see that she was not afraid, that she was not pleading, that she was standing in the full dignity of a woman who knows her own truth even when a room is arranged against her. Then she looked away. "Good afternoon, Your Grace." She walked out of the library without hurrying, through the hall, up the stairs, to the small room at the back of the house that was hers, with its narrow window and its single bookshelf and the Latin grammar with her father's handwriting in the margins. She sat on the edge of her bed and held the grammar in her lap and did not cry, because she had long since discovered that crying required an audience of at least one sympathetic witness, and she had no one to offer her that. She had known, she reminded herself. She had known from the beginning that this was exactly how these things went. She had the evidence of 8 years of careful practice. She had built invisibility into her bones precisely because visibility carried this cost. The cost of being seen meant someone could always see you wrongly. She had told herself she was not hoping. She had been lying. The evening was long. Lady Harwick had arranged a small musical gathering in the drawing room, and Eleanor sat in her usual chair near the window and played her usual role and spoke, when spoken to, and volunteered nothing. Mrs. Voss performed the harp with accomplished ease. Miss Arabella sang 2 songs. The Duke sat near the fire, and Eleanor did not look at him, and she was very practiced at not looking at people, and she was not certain, not at all certain, that she succeeded. At one point during the second song, she felt his gaze on her, the specific quality of it that she had learned to recognize over 11 days. She kept her eyes on her folded hands and waited for it to pass. It did not pass quickly. When the evening ended and the party dispersed toward their respective rooms, Eleanor was the last to leave the drawing room, as was her habit, ensuring the candles were extinguished and Lady Harwick had what she needed. She was nearly at the door when a voice, low and careful, stopped her. "Miss Vane." She turned. The Duke was standing in the doorway. The rest of the party had moved on ahead. They were effectively alone in the dim corridor, one candle burning in its sconce between them. She looked at him, said nothing, waited. "I considered the source," he said. The words were quiet enough that they did not travel beyond the two of them. She absorbed them without expression, holding very still in the way that she held still when something required steadiness. "And," she said. He looked at her for a long moment, and the candle between them cast warm light on both their faces, and the corridor was very quiet. She saw him at the edge of saying something further, saw him at the border of it, and then saw something close instead, a decision made on the side of caution, the old reflex winning a war she had not been able to see being fought. "And I owe you an apology," he said, "for the manner in which I received what she said. It was not everything. She had hoped, briefly, in the split second before sense overruled hope, that it would be more than this. An apology was proper and careful, and it left every door in the same position it had been in before Mrs. Voss had spoken. Neither opened further nor closed. "There is nothing to apologize for," Eleanor said, because she was generous with the grace she could not afford to spend, always had been. "Good night, Your Grace." She went upstairs. She lay in the dark with the Latin grammar on her chest and listened to the house settle into its nighttime silences and thought that there were 2 days remaining of the fortnight, and then this would be over, and she would be precisely where she had been on the 14th of March, invisible and sufficient and not hoping. She thought about his face in the candlelight, the border she had seen him standing on, the decision against. She thought, she could not help it, about what might lie on the other side of that decision, if anything could move him across it. She told herself she would not find out. She was, as she had been before, not entirely right. The last 2 days of a fortnight have a particular quality when you are waiting for them to end. They stretch and compress in equal measure, too long when you are inside them, too short when you consider what their ending means. Eleanor woke on the 13th morning of the Duke's fortnight with the clear-eyed resolution of a woman who has talked herself, very thoroughly, back to sense. She had been foolish. Not catastrophically so, not in any way that was visible to anyone else, but foolish in the private way that costs the most, in the way of having allowed herself to want something she had no right to want, in the way of having briefly, dangerously, believed that things might be other than they were. She was a companion in a borrowed house. He was the Duke of Marlowe. The distance between those two facts was not a thing to be crossed by 11 days of breakfast conversation and a shared preference for morning silence, and the strange warmth of being looked at as if one were legible. She dressed. She went downstairs. She was measured and composed, and she would see out these 2 remaining days as she had seen out 8 years of similar mornings, with patience and sufficiency and the Latin grammar in her room as proof that she had survived worse losses than hope. Breakfast was already occupied when she arrived, not by the Duke this time, but by Sir Reginald, who sat at the head of the table with his coffee and his opinions arranged before him in equal prominence. Mrs. Voss was there too, perfectly turned out at an hour that suggested either vanity or strategy. Eleanor took her plate and her usual chair and unfolded her napkin with the careful ceremony of a person who is performing normality quite deliberately. Sir Reginald waited until the footman had withdrawn. "I understand," he said, with the comfortable authority of a man who has never been required to measure his words, "that there has been quite a deal of intellectual discussion this fortnight. Philosophy, political economy." He smiled with his teeth. "Lady Harwick keeps a most unusual companion." Eleanor spread butter on her toast with an even hand. "It must be gratifying," Sir Reginald continued, "to find an audience for such things. One imagines there are few enough opportunities, in your situation, for that sort of conversation." He picked up his coffee. "One must take what is available, I suppose." The implication was laid as neatly as a trap. That she had been performing, as Mrs. Voss had said. That her conversations with the Duke had been strategy rather than substance. That her intelligence itself was a tool she had deployed for want of better options. Eleanor set down her knife. She looked at Sir Reginald with the particular steadiness of a woman who has been spoken to this way before and has learned that the response which costs the least is also the one that lands the hardest. "You are very kind," she said pleasantly, and returned to her toast. It was not a response Sir Reginald knew how to answer. He opened his mouth, found nothing adequate, and retreated into his coffee. Mrs. Voss studied the tablecloth. Eleanor ate her breakfast with a composure that was entirely real by the time she finished it, which was a small victory, and the only kind she was accustomed to counting. She did not see the Duke in the doorway until she rose to leave. He was standing just inside the entrance to the breakfast room, his coat on, his gloves in his hand, the expression on his face one she had not seen before. Not the complicated attention, not the careful withdrawal of 2 nights ago. Something rawer than either, and more still, the stillness of a man who has witnessed something and is deciding what it means. He had heard Sir Reginald. She understood this instantly. She held his gaze for a moment, offered nothing in her own expression that could be read as an appeal, and moved past him toward the door. "Miss Vane," he said. She stopped. She had stopped at that voice more times than she could count in 13 days, and every time she had turned to find something worth the turning. She did not know if that record would hold. She turned. "Will you walk?" he said. She looked at him. The request was simple, and it was not simple at all. "It will rain," she said. "Yes," he agreed. "Probably." She got her coat. They went out into the garden where the morning had the particular uncertain quality of early spring, the sky a pale layered gray that could not quite decide. The gravel path was damp underfoot. The hedgerows were further into green than they had been on their first walk, the buds now committed, the color definite. He did not speak for a long time. Neither did she. She had learned to trust these silences with him, which was itself a kind of trust she had not intended to form, and she was aware of this, aware of all of it, aware that she was walking beside him for what was likely the last time, and that she would remember the exact quality of the light. "Lady Harwick spoke to me yesterday," he said. Eleanor looked ahead at the path. "She told me about the 12 books," he said. "She told me about your father's estate, and what was sold, and what was kept. She told me about the solicitor's son who left." A pause. "She did not tell me these things as an argument. I want you to understand that. She told them the way someone tells the truth when they have decided the truth is overdue." Eleanor said nothing. Something had tightened in her throat that she was managing with effort. "She also told me," he said, "that Lord Fairwick spent his visit in the billiard room and the study and one afternoon riding with Lord Harwick, and that his entire acquaintance with you consisted of 2 dinners during which you said, in her recollection, very little." He stopped walking. She stopped beside him. He turned to face her, and the expression on his face was the one she had seen him standing at the border of in the corridor, the one that had not crossed, the one she had stopped hoping to see. It had crossed now. She could see everything in it that he had been keeping behind the careful walls of his restraint, the conflict that had spent 2 days resolving itself into something decisive, something that had the quality of a man who has made a choice and is done second-guessing it. "I have been afraid," he said, "for a long time. Not of obvious things. Not of failure or hardship. I rebuilt the estate from near ruin. I know how to manage difficulty." He looked at her steadily. "I have been afraid of exactly what has happened to me in the last 13 days, of being certain about a person, of trusting what I see in someone when I know, from considerable evidence, that what one sees is not always what is real." Eleanor held very still. "But I am also," he said, "a man who spent 6 years gathering evidence for a case he never brought to court, out of loyalty to a principle that cost him personally. And so I know something about the difference between caution and the endless postponement of living." He paused. "You said that you had stopped allowing fear to be the final word. I have been thinking about that since the morning you said it." "I remember saying it," Eleanor said carefully. "I believed you then," he said. "I believe you now. And I find that I am tired of being the only one in this conversation still letting fear have the final word." She looked at him. She was aware of the whole garden around them, the damp gravel and the committed green of the hedgerows and the undecided sky, all of it very precise and real. She was aware of herself, Eleanor Vane, a scholar's daughter with a borrowed coat and 12 chosen books and 8 years of carefully maintained invisibility, standing in front of the Duke of Marlowe while he looked at her as though she were the most important thing in his particular compass. "What are you saying?" she said, and her voice was steady, which cost her something. "Precisely. I am saying," he said, "that I have no interest in returning to London and resuming a life from which you are absent. I am saying that I would very much prefer you were not absent from it." He paused. "I am saying that the most interesting, the most honest, the most genuinely surprising conversations I have had in years have all been with you, and that I would like to continue having them, for the foreseeable future, in a more formal capacity." "A more formal capacity," Eleanor repeated. "I am asking you to marry me," he said. Plainly, if the formal capacity was unclear. The rain began. Not dramatically, not the London rain that arrived with conviction, but the tentative beginning of it, the first few drops that test the air before committing. Neither of them moved. "You should know," Eleanor said, because she was thorough and she was honest, and she would not walk into this without being both, "that I bring nothing. No fortune, no connections, no social advantage of any kind. I have a coat I have worn for 4 years and 12 books, and a great many opinions that I have thus far managed to mostly restrain." "You have not restrained them particularly," he said, and the corner of his mouth moved in the way she had catalogued, in the way she had come to love. I restrained them for 8 years before you arrived, she said. You are a disruption. I am beginning to regard that as a compliment, he said. He took a step closer. The rain was definite now, soft and steady, beginning to darken the shoulders of his coat and cool the air between them. Eleanor, her given name, not Miss Vane. The border crossed, fully, without retraction. You have spent 8 years, he said quietly, being told in every possible register that you did not belong, that you were insufficient, that your intelligence was a strategy and your worth was contingent. I am telling you that every one of those assessments was wrong, not as a comfort, as a fact. You are the most complete person I have met. You are the only person who has spoken to me in 13 days as though I were also a complete person, rather than a title and a consequence. That is not nothing. That is, in my experience, exceedingly rare. Eleanor felt the tightening in her throat resolve itself into something else entirely. Something that burned at the backs of her eyes and would not be managed away. You are not being cautious, she said. No, he agreed. I am not. You said caution was the lesson your father's life taught you. It was. He held her gaze. And I said, the last day we walked this lane, that caution has its limits. I was not speaking abstractly. He offered his hand, not in the formal way of escort, palm up, open, unhurried. A question made visible. What do you say, Eleanor? I would like the final word to be yours. She looked at his hand. She looked at his face. She thought about the unfinished proof in the trunk, and the 11-year-old girl reading lock on a cold floor, and the 12 books carried out of a house while the rest was sold, and a solicitor's son with nice enough eyes who had been practical, and 8 years of invisibility, so practiced it had begun to feel like identity. She thought about what it had felt like, on the first morning, to be seen. She put her hand in his. Yes, she said, though I reserve the right to continue disagreeing with you about Kant. He closed his fingers around hers, and the almost smile became the real thing, full and unguarded and transforming his face into something she suspected very few people had ever been permitted to see. It was, she thought, an extraordinary thing, to be the one who got to see it. I would expect nothing less, he said. The rain came down around them, steady and soft, and neither of them moved to go inside. The news moved through Harwick House with the particular velocity of information that people have been half expecting and fully unprepared for. Lady Harwick received it with tears she did not attempt to conceal, pressing Eleanor's hands in hers and saying, twice, that she had known, that she had simply known, which was a generous revision of a history that had in fact contained considerable uncertainty. But Eleanor received it warmly, all the same. Lord Harwick shook the Duke's hand with the solid approval of a man for whom most things resolve themselves into property and its proper management, and found in this resolution something that satisfied him entirely. Sir Reginald Voss said, nothing of consequence. He was seen to recalibrate his expression 3 times at dinner that evening as the situation settled over him, each recalibration less successful than the last, until he arrived at a kind of fixed pleasantness that convinced no one. Eleanor met his eyes once across the table, briefly, and offered him the same pleasant nothing she had offered at breakfast, and found it considerably more satisfying the second time. Mrs. Voss departed the following morning, citing a previous engagement that had inexplicably materialized overnight. Her departure was accomplished with grace and warmth, and a farewell to Eleanor that was accomplished entirely in the register of a woman who has decided to treat her defeat as a strategic withdrawal. Eleanor wished her a safe journey with complete sincerity. The last evening of the fortnight, the boundary negotiations concluded, the papers signed, the entire official purpose of the Duke's visit accomplished in the shadow of everything else that had occurred, there was a small dinner. 8 people, candlelight on silver, the fire well built against the April chill that had moved in behind the rain. Eleanor sat in her usual chair near the window, and then did not sit there, because the Duke, arriving last as he always arrived, came directly to the seat beside her and settled into it with the ease of a man who has decided precisely where he intends to be and has no interest in sitting anywhere else. Lady Harwick's expression across the table was a thing of contained delight. The footman refilling glasses performed a small adjustment to the arrangement of the table with the suppressed satisfaction of a member of a household that has followed a story to its conclusion and found the ending satisfactory. Eleanor looked at the Duke beside her. He looked back. Something moved between them in the candlelight, something warm and private and completely indifferent to the room. "You are aware," she said quietly, "that everyone is looking at us." "I am," he said, in the tone of a man entirely unbothered by this. And I find," he said, "that I do not particularly mind." She understood, then, in a way that required no further explanation. He had spent 15 years rebuilding a dukedom and managing a reputation that he wore as armor. This, choosing her publicly, without apology, in the small, unambiguous language of where he sat, and with what ease, was its own kind of declaration. Not performed, not announced, simply done. It was, she thought, entirely him. Weeks later, when the engagement was made formal and the notices were properly dispatched and London had received the information and produced the expected wave of astonished speculation, Eleanor was in the library at Harwick House, taking down the volume on land reform that she had been meaning to return for a month. She pulled it from the shelf and opened it to the page she had been reading the afternoon he first sat across from her in the gray rain light, the afternoon of the companionable silence that had changed everything. The Duke found her there. He came into the library the way he always came into rooms now, without announcement, without formality between them, simply present in the way of a person who has established his right to a space by the quality of what has happened in it. She held up the book. "I never finished this." He took it from her and read the chapter heading. Land Enclosure and Tenant Rights, 1790 to 1815. He set it on the table between the chairs. "We could read it now." She looked at him. He looked at her. The library was the same as it had always been, the shelves reaching to the ceiling, the fire laid in the grate, the chairs arranged as they had been on a rainy afternoon in March when two people who had both become very good at invisibility discovered, in the company of each other, that they did not need it anymore. The same room. Everything in it entirely altered. "We could," Eleanor said. They sat. The fire was warm. The light through the tall windows was the late gold of a spring afternoon finally keeping its promises. Eleanor opened to her page and was, within 2 paragraphs, actually reading, and beside her the Duke was similarly absorbed, and the silence between them was the specific kind that belongs only to two people who have found in each other the rarest of things. A home that is also an equal. She had been invisible for 8 years. She had been overlooked, dismissed, assessed and found convenient and left to manage on dignity and books and the patient accumulation of what she knew. She had said one sentence at a dinner table on the 14th of March and set something in motion that she could not have predicted and had not sought and had very nearly been too sensible to allow. She was not invisible now. She looked across the page at the man beside her, the man who had looked at her at first as though she did not exist, and had then, in the space of 13 days and 1 sentence and a question held open between them until she was ready to answer it, looked at her as though she were the most legible thing in his world. The man who had brought his caution like a shield and set it down. The man who had told her the truth and received it in return and found the exchange sufficient. He did not look up from his book, but the corner of his mouth moved, just barely, in the way she had catalogued from the very first evening. He had known she was looking. She returned to her page and felt the smile settle into her chest like the thing it had always been, warmth and recognition and the quiet, complete assurance of being, at last, exactly where one belongs. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.